Welcome to a new chapter in your life. Today we'll unlock the principles that high achievers use to build lives of purpose, impact, and fulfillment. These strategies aren't just theories. They're tested methods for success that will take you to the next level. Ready to step into your power? Let's get started. When you stop talking to an avoidant man, it's not just a matter of cutting off communication. What happens in the space of silence is far more profound than you might think. At first, it may seem like he's unaffected, as if he's simply going about his life without a second thought. However, beneath the surface, his internal world begins to shift. And the silence you create becomes a mirror that reflects his deepest fears and emotional conflicts. The moment you stop reaching out, you stir something within him that he has long avoided. His own vulnerabilities. He may try to dismiss it at first, hiding behind the walls he has built to protect himself from his feelings. But the silence forces him to confront those very walls, and in doing so, a powerful internal conflict begins to emerge. He is caught between the desire for connection and the fear of intimacy, between the comfort of emotional distance and the longing for closeness. The absence of your presence becomes a reminder that he is avoiding something much deeper within himself, something he has tried to bury for years. It's in this space of quiet that the real transformation begins. The longer the silence stretches, the more his internal discomfort grows. He may feel restless, uneasy, and increasingly aware of something missing in his life. It's as if his mind can't fully process the void, and yet he knows on some level that it is tied to the emotional distance he's been keeping. The silence forces him to look inward, and it's here that he must face what he's been avoiding all along: his own feelings, his fears, and the emotional walls that have been keeping him from experiencing true connection. As you continue to hold back, the power of emotional distance creates a sense of loss within him. He starts to question his own actions, the choices he made that led to this moment. His mind begins to spiral into a state of confusion and self-doubt. He might wonder why he has pushed you away, why he has kept his emotions at bay for so long. This internal questioning can be both painful and transformative, as it challenges everything he's believed about himself and his capacity for intimacy. The interesting thing about this shift is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow process, one that unfolds over time. At first, he may feel a sense of relief when you pull away, convinced that he has gained back control. But as the days pass, the initial relief starts to fade, and what's left is the overwhelming realization that he misses you. This longing isn't just about wanting to have you back. It's about realizing that the emotional connection he's been avoiding is exactly what he needs to feel whole. In this space of absence, he starts to feel a deeper yearning that he might not have been fully aware of before. The emotional walls that he thought would protect him now start to feel like a cage. The more he tries to ignore the feeling, the stronger it becomes. It's like a quiet ache, an unspoken desire for something more than the isolation he's been comfortable with. The longer you stay silent, the more he begins to understand that the very thing he pushed away is the thing he now craves. This internal struggle can create a sense of panic within him. He might start to imagine that you are slipping away, that you have moved on, and that he has lost his chance with you forever. This imagined loss triggers an emotional response that is far stronger than anything he anticipated. The panic isn't just about losing you, it's about losing control over his own emotions and the reality he has carefully constructed. He's suddenly faced with the very thing he has been running from: the need for emotional connection and vulnerability. As this process unfolds, the silence you've created becomes a powerful catalyst for growth. The absence of communication forces him to confront his own emotional blockages, and face the fears that have kept him stuck in a pattern of avoidance. Over time, he starts to realize that avoiding connection hasn't served him well. In fact, it has only left him feeling empty, disconnected, and unsatisfied. The longer the silence continues, the more he begins to see the truth, that emotional closeness is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. In this space of silence, the avoidant man starts to realize that real intimacy doesn't come from running away. It comes from allowing himself to be vulnerable and open. The walls that he built around his emotions are slowly starting to crumble, and with each passing day he feels the pull toward change. He may not fully understand it yet, but the absence of your presence is teaching him something invaluable, that connection and closeness are essential for his emotional well-being. As you continue to hold your ground, the avoidant man begins to experience a shift in his perception. He starts to understand that his fears of being vulnerable and open with others are holding him back from the happiness and connection he truly desires. The silence you've created has given him the space to reflect, to reevaluate, and to begin the process of emotional healing. What started as a simple act of withdrawal has become a powerful invitation for growth, both for him and for the potential of your relationship. When you stop talking to an avoidant man, you create a shift that goes beyond simple silence. It's a paradox that's both powerful and emotional, one that not only impacts him but transforms the very dynamic between the two of you. At first, he may appear unaffected, even relieved, as if the space you've created brings him comfort. However, this initial sense of relief quickly gives way to a deeper, more complex emotional experience that he may not be ready to face. For an avoidant man, the concept of emotional closeness is a constant struggle. He has built a wall around himself to protect from the vulnerability that comes with truly connecting with another person. This defense mechanism keeps him at a distance, both from you and from his own emotions. But when you stop reaching out, when you no longer chase or try to fill the silence with communication, the very thing he has been avoiding begins to knock at the door of his consciousness. The paradox lies in the fact that although he might feel relief in the moment, that relief is short-lived. As the silence deepens, his sense of control begins to unravel. The avoidance, which he once thought would shield him from pain, now becomes the very thing that creates discomfort and longing. He may not immediately recognize this shift, but subconsciously, he begins to feel something missing. The emotional void you've left behind starts to grow, and with it, a quiet sense of longing begins to emerge within him. This emotional disconnect he's been maintaining suddenly feels like a heavy weight. The avoidance that once seemed like a protective shield now feels like a cage. What was once an easy escape from the intensity of emotional connection now becomes the source of his internal conflict. The longer you stay silent, the more that cage tightens, and the more he starts to realize that the very thing he's been avoiding, real intimacy, is exactly what he craves deep down. It's a strange contradiction because on the one hand, he may still feel the urge to maintain his emotional distance. The fear of getting too close to you, of being vulnerable, remains ever present. But on the other hand, the absence of your presence begins to highlight just how much he misses the connection he once had with you. The avoidance that was meant to protect him now leaves him feeling more exposed than ever. The silence you've created isn't just about absence, it's a catalyst that forces him to face the uncomfortable truth that he has been running from. He wants you, he desires the connection, but he fears it at the same time. This paradox continues to play out in his mind. The more you withdraw, the more he is confronted with the reality of what he truly wants. He may start to question his own actions, the decisions he made that led to this point. Why did he push you away? What was he afraid of? these questions begin to surface, and though he may try to bury them, they won't go away. The longer you remain distant, the more he must confront these questions head on, and the more he realizes that his avoidance has only left him in a state of emotional stagnation. The paradox becomes even more pronounced when you consider how avoidance and desire interact. As you create distance, he starts to feel the pull toward you, not just because he misses your presence, but because your absence has illuminated the things he has been hiding from. He begins to recognize that real intimacy is not a threat, but a deep human need that he has been denying. The more he imagines you slipping away, the more urgent his desire becomes to bridge the emotional gap that he has created between you. But here's where the paradox deepens. As his desire grows, so does his fear. The closer he gets to acknowledging that he wants to be with you, the more he's confronted with the very emotions that triggered his avoidance in the first place. It's as though every step toward you is met with a step backward, a push and pull dynamic that confuses him even more. He wants to connect, but the fear of getting hurt, the fear of losing control holds him back. This internal conflict is what keeps him stuck in a perpetual loop of wanting and avoiding, reaching for intimacy while simultaneously pulling away from it. The silence you've created forces him to confront the duality of his emotions. His desire for connection and his fear of vulnerability cannot exist in harmony for long. The paradox is that, in his attempt to protect himself from emotional pain, he's only creating more pain for himself. The more he resists the closeness he needs, the more he feels its absence, and the stronger his longing becomes. What happens next is key. As the emotional tension builds, he may begin to take small steps toward bridging the gap between you. He might reach out, perhaps tentatively at first, unsure of what to expect. But by this point, the walls he has built around himself have begun to crack. The fear of rejection, the fear of intimacy may still be there, but it's no longer enough to keep him in complete avoidance. The inaction then begins. How is it going to be taken over? He starts to recognize that the connection he feared is actually what he has been longing for all along. The paradox of avoidance is not just about running away from something. It's about the deep-seated desire for closeness and connection that is hidden beneath the fear. When you stop talking to him, you force him to see this contradiction. You help him realize that the walls he's built around his heart no longer serve him, and in fact, they are the very thing that prevents him from experiencing the intimacy he truly wants. It's when you stop talking to an avoidant man, you create a moment of profound emotional transformation, not just for you, but for him as well. The absence of communication and the emotional distance you've created often act as a powerful trigger for growth, stirring emotions and reflections that he's likely avoided for a long time. It's a process that forces him to confront his own emotional world, the very emotions he's been running from, and perhaps for the first time, he's faced with the reality that growth comes not from avoiding feelings, but from embracing them. The silence you leave in your wake doesn't just create a void. It opens a door for emotional evolution, a chance for him to break free from the patterns that have kept him stuck in his own emotional prison, both because it allows you to not keep something to yourself from any given situation. Initially, he may resist this emotional growth. For someone who's been conditioned to avoid intimacy and emotional connection, the sudden silence can feel overwhelming and uncomfortable. His first instinct might be to close off even more, retreating into the safety of emotional distance. He may even try to justify his behavior, telling himself that avoiding deeper connection is the right choice for him. Yet, the absence you've created is not just a simple void. It's a catalyst for emotional awareness. The longer he is left to sit in the silence, the more he begins to recognize the absence of something meaningful. something he might not have realized he truly wanted until it's gone. In this moment of emotional isolation, the walls he's built around his heart begin to weaken. At first, it may feel like a storm of confusion and uncertainty. The emotional space you've created begins to stir up feelings he's long ignored: loneliness, longing, fear, and even regret. His natural inclination may be to avoid these feelings, to push them away, in favor of keeping his emotional distance. However, as the silence stretches, it becomes harder and harder to ignore these emotions. They start to bubble to the surface, demanding his attention and forcing him to question the way he's been approaching love, relationships, and his own emotional well-being. In this period of reflection, he may begin to realize that emotional growth isn't something that happens in isolation. It's something that comes through connection, through vulnerability, and through the willingness to face one's own fears and insecurities. The more he resists confronting these emotions, the more powerful they become, slowly eroding the foundation of emotional avoidance he has carefully constructed. In this space, he's faced with a difficult truth. Growth cannot happen without change, and change cannot happen without embracing vulnerability. The longer the silence between you lingers, the clearer this truth becomes. The absence you've created forces him to come face to face with his emotional wounds. He begins to recognize the patterns of avoidance that have shaped his relationships and his emotional life. He may realize that by pushing others away, he's not protecting himself from pain. Instead, he's preventing himself from experiencing the depth and richness of true emotional connection. This realization is often a painful one, as it forces him to acknowledge the ways in which his fears have kept him from living fully. However, it's also a moment of great potential, because for the first time he's ready to confront these feelings head-on. As he navigates through this emotional growth, he may begin to experience moments of self-compassion. He might reflect on his past and understand that his fear of intimacy isn't something to be ashamed of, but rather something that can be healed. The absence between you two becomes a healing space, allowing him to work through his own emotional barriers and consider new ways of relating to others. He starts to realize that emotional growth isn't about perfecting oneself, it's about embracing the full spectrum of emotions, both the light and the dark, and learning to move through them with grace and courage. This emotional growth doesn't happen all at once, and it's not a linear process. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when he may feel overwhelmed by the emotions he's confronting. But over time, the silence between you forces him to keep moving forward, to keep reflecting, and to keep growing. With each passing day, he gains more clarity about his own emotional needs, his fears, and his desires. He begins to understand that the emotional growth he's been avoiding is the key to living a more authentic, fulfilling life. One where he no longer has to hide behind walls or shields, but can instead open his heart to the possibility of real connection. The beauty of this emotional growth is that it doesn't just change him, it changes the way he approaches relationships, including the one he has with you. As he learns to embrace vulnerability and emotional openness, he begins to see the value in deep, meaningful connections. He begins to understand that love is not about control, avoidance, or protecting oneself from pain. It's about allowing oneself to experience the full range of emotions, knowing that growth comes from both the joy and the heartbreak that come with it. He realizes that emotional growth doesn't mean perfection. It means the courage to show up, to be present, and to open up, even when it's difficult. When he finally emerges from this emotional growth process, he's not the same person he was before. The avoidance that once defined his behavior has been replaced with a new understanding of himself and his capacity for love. He's learned that true emotional freedom comes from being able to feel deeply, to connect without fear, and to move through life's challenges with an open heart. His emotional growth becomes a source of strength, one that not only enriches his relationship with you, but also enhances his ability to connect with others in a more authentic, meaningful way. When you stop talking to an avoidant man, you unknowingly step into a role that holds immense power, the power to catalyze transformation. The silence you create doesn't just affect the dynamic between the two of you, it triggers a deep internal process within him that often leads to profound change. As much as he may try to resist, the absence you've created serves as a mirror, reflecting back to him the parts of himself that he's spent years hiding, denying, or avoiding. In this space of emotional absence, you unknowingly hold the key to unlocking the transformation he so desperately needs, but may not have been able to initiate on his own. The power you hold is not in forcing him to change, but in stepping away and allowing him to see the consequences of his actions, or more accurately, the consequences of his avoidance. At first, he may try to ignore the emotional shift caused by your silence. He may even convince himself that he's perfectly fine, that the emotional distance you've created means little to him. Yet the truth is that your absence is not just a lack of communication. It's a space that forces him to reckon with the inner conflict he's been avoiding for so long. It forces him to see the reality of his actions and, in turn, the reality of his emotional world. For someone who avoids intimacy, the silence you leave behind can feel like a profound loss. The emotional withdrawal may initially feel like a small victory for him, a way to reclaim control over a situation that feels too vulnerable. However, as time goes on, the absence becomes more noticeable. It highlights the emptiness that avoidance has created within him, the emotional void that he's long tried to fill with distractions, superficial connections, or even just the illusion of emotional safety. But in this silence, he's left with nothing to hide behind. The walls he's built around himself start to weaken, and the things he's been avoiding begin to rise to the surface. What happens next is where your power truly lies. You've given him the space to reflect on his own emotions, to understand the deeper roots of his fears, insecurities, and the reasons why he avoids getting close to others. The absence between you is not a punishment, but an opportunity for growth, a chance for him to face the things he's been running from. It's in this silence that the possibility of transformation begins to take shape. When there's nothing else to distract him, the truth of his own emotional state becomes impossible to ignore. In this space, you hold the power to transform him, not through direct action or words, but through your absence. This absence isn't just a physical one, it's emotional and psychological. By stepping away, you provide him with the clarity to recognize his own emotional barriers and the ways in which they have kept him from experiencing the depth of connection that he truly desires. The silence forces him to confront his avoidance patterns and question whether they're serving him or keeping him from living a more fulfilling life. While he may initially resist this process, over time the impact of your absence becomes undeniable. He begins to reflect on his own behavior, his choices, and the way he's interacted with you and others. He starts to understand that his avoidance wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was a way of holding himself back from experiencing true vulnerability, emotional intimacy, and love. The more time he spends in this reflective space, the more he realizes that the emotional distance he's created is not a form of self-protection, but a form of self-sabotage. In essence, the very act of stepping away from him has forced him to confront his deepest fears and begin the process of emotional healing. The beauty of your power lies in how it subtly shifts his perception of himself and his emotional needs. As he navigates the silence, he begins to recognize that emotional connection isn't something to fear, but something to embrace. He starts to see that intimacy and vulnerability are not weaknesses, but strengths that allow him to experience deeper relationships and personal growth. In this way, your absence becomes a pathway to transformation, offering him the opportunity to evolve into a version of himself that is capable of emotional intimacy and connection. It's important to note that this transformation is not immediate. Change, especially deep emotional change, takes time and effort. There will be moments of resistance, doubt, and even frustration as he faces the uncomfortable emotions that arise during this period of reflection. However, as the silence continues, he begins to realize that he cannot escape his own emotional truth. The more he grapples with the absence you've created, the more he starts to understand that his avoidance has been holding him back from experiencing the richness of life and love that he craves. In this space of transformation, you play an essential role, not because you are actively changing him, but because you have given him the opportunity to change himself. You've created the conditions in which his emotional growth can begin. Through your absence, you've shown him that true emotional connection requires vulnerability and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. In its own way, the longer he's left with his own thoughts, the more he's forced to confront the fact that his fear of intimacy is ultimately his greatest obstacle to living a fuller, more connected life. When you stop talking to an avoidant man, something shifts within him that goes far beyond simple distance or silence. It's a mental and emotional trigger that taps into the power of his own assumptions, pulling his deepest thoughts and fears to the surface. The law of assumption is at play here, working silently yet powerfully within him, influencing his perception of reality and his emotional response. It's his assumptions, which have been built over time, now begin to shape the outcome of this situation, even though he may not fully realize it. At first, when you stop communicating, his assumption might be that you'll move on without him. It's a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from the vulnerability of truly feeling and experiencing connection. He assumes that, just like in the past, emotional distance will help him regain control over his feelings. The assumption he holds is that silence will lead to him being less emotionally impacted by the situation. He believes that if he can avoid deep emotional involvement, he won't face the potential pain that comes with opening up and allowing someone in. This belief, however, is rooted in fear, and it will begin to unravel as the silence between you two lingers. The moment you create distance, you start to challenge these assumptions, even without saying a word. His mind begins to spin, and the belief that he can control his emotions by keeping his distance begins to weaken. The law of assumption operates silently, planting seeds in his mind that something is amiss. He starts to wonder, what if you no longer need him? What if your absence isn't something he can ignore? As his thoughts start to spiral, he begins to entertain a new assumption, one that is rooted in the fear of loss. The assumption that you might move on, that you might find someone else, takes hold, and it sends him into a state of emotional unrest. He begins to imagine worst-case scenarios. He assumes that you're better off without him, that his silence and avoidance have pushed you away for good. In his mind, these assumptions start to feel like truth. The more he imagines this reality, the stronger his emotional response becomes. The more he assumes that you're slipping away, the more it affects him. These assumptions, though they are not grounded in any actual change from your side, begin to influence his emotional state in powerful ways. He might feel a wave of anxiety, a quiet panic setting in, as the fear of losing you consumes his thoughts. This assumption, whether it's conscious or not, begins to shape his reality, making him believe that the emotional distance is not just physical, but emotional, permanent, and irreversible. As the silence continues, this assumption feeds into itself. The longer he thinks about it, the more it begins to feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. His assumptions about your feelings, about his own worth, and about the future of your connection become more ingrained in his mind. It's not just about the absence of communication. It's about the narrative he starts to tell himself. He assumes that because you've stopped reaching out, you no longer care. And that assumption builds a story of rejection and loss. This story becomes the lens through which he views everything that is happening. In reality, his assumptions may not be true, but in his mind, they begin to dictate his emotions and actions. This mental process begins to manifest in his behavior. His assumptions create a sense of urgency, even though he may not yet recognize it. He might reach out to you, trying to regain control over the situation, but his attempt to break the silence is rooted in his need to ease the discomfort his assumptions have caused. He assumes that reaching out will either prove his fears wrong or confirm them, and in doing so, he might find himself caught in a cycle of uncertainty and emotional turbulence. The fear of rejection drives him to act, but it's still rooted in the assumptions he's been making all along. The law of assumption not only impacts how he views the current situation, but also how he views himself in relation to you. He assumes that you may have already made up your mind about him. He might assume that you're tired of waiting, tired of the emotional roller coaster he has put you on, and he begins to see himself as unworthy of the connection you once shared. These assumptions fuel his insecurities and fears, keeping him trapped in a cycle of doubt and confusion. The more he dwells on these assumptions, the more they shape his perception of reality, and the more he feels disconnected from the person he once thought he could control, himself. However, this mental process isn't one-sided. The law of assumption also influences how you perceive the situation. Your own assumptions, your own beliefs about his behavior may be creating an equally powerful response. You may assume that he doesn't care, that he's emotionally unavailable, and that his avoidance is intentional. These assumptions about his feelings and actions begin to shape your reality as well. What's crucial to understand is that the assumptions both of you carry are not necessarily rooted in truth. They are simply projections of your internal beliefs. The deeper the silence stretches, the more entrenched your assumptions become. Your actions, your words, and even your thoughts begin to reflect these assumptions. The more he assumes that you're slipping away, the more desperate he may become to make contact, trying to pull you back in, driven by the belief that he cannot afford to lose you. As this cycle of assumptions continues, it becomes clear that what you both believe is influencing the outcome more than the actual reality of the situation. When you start talking to an avoidant man, something profound begins to unfold, not just within him, but within the very dynamic between you. The absence you've created becomes more than just a lack of communication. It serves as a space for self-reflection, a moment in time when he's forced to confront emotions he has long avoided. The silence between you two provides an opportunity for him to look inward, to grapple with the complexities of his own feelings, beliefs, and actions. It's in this silence that the things he has buried within himself begin to surface. And for the first time in a long time, he may find himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love, connection, and vulnerability. At first, when you stop reaching out, he may not fully realize the depth of the impact this absence will have on him. He may initially feel a sense of relief or even satisfaction, as if he's regained some semblance of control over the situation. After all, for someone who has spent so much of their life avoiding emotional intimacy, silence is often seen as a safeguard. It feels like a protective barrier, a way to prevent the emotional closeness that he subconsciously fears. However, as the silence stretches on, something begins to shift. The absence you've created starts to unravel the assumptions he's built around himself, around you, and around the relationship. This silence, rather than being a simple lack of communication, becomes a catalyst for introspection. The space you've created forces him to reflect on the choices he's made, the walls he's put up, and the reasons behind his avoidance. He's no longer able to distract himself with superficial conversations or temporary emotional barriers. Instead, he's left with nothing but his own thoughts and feelings. And in this space, the things he's avoided for so long begin to surface. He might start to ask himself hard questions. Why has he been so afraid of emotional closeness? What is it about connection that makes him feel vulnerable and out of control? Does he want to stay in a pattern of pushing people away, or is there something more that he truly craves? In many ways, absence serves as a mirror, reflecting back to him the emotions and desires he has been too afraid to confront. The longer you stay away, the more intense this self-reflection becomes. He begins to realize that the emotional distance he's created between you and him is not just a form of protection. It's a way of avoiding the deep-seated fears and insecurities that prevent him from truly connecting with another person. The absence you've created highlights the emotional void that exists within him, one that he may not have even fully recognized before. As he reflects, he might start to understand that the very things he's been avoiding, the vulnerability, the intimacy, the emotional openness, are also the things he needs in order to feel whole. The silence has given him the space to see the truth, that his fears of rejection and abandonment have kept him from experiencing the deep connection he truly. The absence, while initially a shield, begins to feel like a painful reminder of what he's lost and what he stands to gain if he can open up and allow himself to be vulnerable. This period of self-reflection can also bring up feelings of regret and guilt. He might start to question whether he's pushed you too far away, whether his avoidance has caused irreparable damage to the relationship. As he contemplates the consequences of his actions, he might begin to feel a deep sense of longing for the connection he once had with you. The absence you've created makes him realize that what he took for granted is now slipping through his fingers, and the realization that he might lose you entirely forces him to confront the reality of his own emotional limitations. However, this self-reflection isn't always a smooth process. For someone who is avoidant, the initial stages of introspection can be uncomfortable, even painful. He may resist facing the truth, finding ways to distract himself or justify his behavior. But over time, as the silence between you stretches, he can no longer avoid the reality of the situation. The absence you've created forces him to look deeper into his own heart, to confront the fears and wounds that have shaped his behavior. This is a moment of reckoning for him, one that can either lead to growth and transformation or reinforce his patterns of emotional withdrawal. As he navigates this internal journey, he may begin to recognize the patterns that have held him back in the past. He might realize that he has been running from intimacy, not because he doesn't want it, but because he has been afraid of the emotional vulnerability it requires. The space you've created through your silence becomes a space for him to break free from these old patterns and consider a new path forward. He might start to question whether he can truly change, whether he can open up to the kind of emotional connection he's been avoiding for so long. The beauty of this absence is that it doesn't just give him space to reflect, it gives him the chance to grow. In the silence, he's left with no distractions, no excuses, just the truth of his own feelings. he might begin to realize that emotional closeness isn't something to fear, but something to embrace. The more he reflects, the more he might begin to see that his fears of vulnerability are holding him back from the kind of love and connection he truly desires. The absence you've created doesn't just make him miss you, it helps him rediscover himself, his own emotional landscape, and his capacity for deeper, more meaningful connections.